Thank you very much, Erin, and thank you to the 19th for hosting us today and having this important conversation. Strengthening our democracy is something that we're very focused on here at Pivotal Ventures right now. And we know that government is effective when it accurately reflects the people that it's meant to serve. There are a number of barriers that prevent women, people of color, and LGBTQ plus people from being able to fully and actively participate in democracy, as we heard in the last panel. And that's certainly true when it comes to administering our elections and the work of our elections officials. States United, who's a very important partner of Pivotal Ventures, is focused on defending free and fair elections and the people that make them possible. So here to tell us more about that work and why it matters is Lizzie Ulmer, the Senior Vice President of Strategy and Communications at States United. So Lizzie, we heard about problems in that last conversation, and particularly some of the problems that impact our elections workers and our elections officials. Could you tell me a little bit about some of the solutions that you work on and think about at States United?
Of course, and thank you so much for having this conversation and for having us here today. So at States United, we care deeply about the people who run our elections, and that's our state officials and our local officials. And when we think about solutions, we think about them in 4 different categories. We think about protecting our elections, the elections we all vote in. We think about accountability for those who are seeking to undermine our democracy, and we think about keeping people safe, meaning the people who are voting and the election officials themselves. And then lastly, jumping off of that last conversation, we care a lot about making sure there's truthful information about elections out there that's critically important now and for the future. And so when I think about some of what that solution looks like, it comes in a lot of different forms. A lot of it comes in support. And that means funding. That means funding support for the election administration at the federal level and at the local level. A lot of election officials are facing limited resources, understaffed, overworked, and we can do a lot to provide them support. It also means supporting good, strong, pro-democracy candidates on all sides of the aisle that are going to be in these positions to run offices or appoint the nonpartisan election officials that are running our elections. And it also means doing the work to hold those accountable that are really pushing the limits of our democracy right now. That means bringing law enforcement into the conversation, prosecuting the people who are at January 6th, making sure it is not okay to threaten or harass or intimidate an election official or a voter. And when we talk about truthful information, it's really important that every organization that can is really working hard to put truthful information out there. Secretaries of state websites are incredible. They're a wealth of information. But if anyone who has gone to one, I can imagine you might have had a similar experience as I do of being like, where exactly is the answer to that question I have about our elections? And in this environment where people are really taking advantage of the lack of information that's out there, it's really important to put truthful information out there and reach people where they are. I mean, we are so diffused in the way that we consume news or what apps we're on or where people and our families might be getting information, so it's really important to do that work.
Well, publications like Politico, the New York Times, the 19th have recently written about the rise of harassment and threats against elections officials. But what often I think is missed in some of those stories is that 80% of election officials are actually women. And I'd love for you to just talk a little bit about who these elections officials are and what are the unique challenges that women in those positions face.
Of course. So I want to take a quick step back. When we think about elections, we think about them as these big national events, but they are really run by the state and at the local level. And in our country, that means by over 10,000 local election jurisdictions, which means over 10,000 local election officials, and over 80% of them are women. These are the people who are, before you even cast your ballot, who are spending months preparing to make sure that the election in your community is safe, secure, and accurate. They are mailing voter registration cards. They are making sure voter registration lists are updated. They are testing voting machines. They are communicating to the public about what's going to happen in the election. They're implementing changes that their state legislatures have made. These are election clerks, election directors, county commissioners. There's a whole host of different titles, and each state has their own system because of the decentralized way that we work. And the women that are in these positions, they face a lot of challenges. They face sexism. That's something that we all know is alive and well today. They face resource limitations and underfunding and being understaffed in a job that is in a place where we are underfunding them, but we are paying closer attention and they're scrutinized like they've never been before post 2020 and dealing with the droves of disinformation that they are today. And when we think about stories like in the first panel when we were talking about Ruby Freeman and Shay Moss, the two Georgia election officials who were the target of rampant conspiracy theories in 2020, they were just doing their jobs, and while they have been able to fight back through defamation lawsuits and other things, their lives are never going to be the same. And for every story like that, there's another election official out there that has a shade of a story that's the same that we might not know about yet, or that we aren't able to talk about on national stages. I think that's really important to keep in mind. And at the same time, these officials often report having really high personal satisfaction with their jobs. I think it's because they take a lot of pride, they're dedicated public servants, but also we have a lot of distrust in institutions in America right now, but trust in elections is really high at the local level. So I think they do understand the role that they play.
So States United was founded after the 2020 elections and in much response to the 2020 elections. And many of us are concerned about what's going to happen in this upcoming election, as others have talked about. So I'd love to hear about what you think has changed since 2020 and what makes you optimistic about the future of the democracy in this country.
This is a great question, and there are three things I often think about when I'm feeling all that anxiety. The first is we're having conversations in mirror spaces like this in a way that we weren't 4 years ago. There's so much attention and interest and support to make sure that our elections can be free, fair, and secure now in a way that we didn't have. And so that gives me a lot of inspiration and a lot of motivation. I'm so grateful to work in an organization that is playing a part in that. The second is something that Sarah Longwell hinted at when she was on stage earlier. When you give voters a chance and when you give them information, they do choose democracy. In 2022, States United did an analysis that showed that election denier candidates paid a really big penalty at the ballot box for their position on elections. In fact, so much so that it could have cost them 5 key statewide positions in swing states. So this issue does matter, and it matters on the margins, and that gives me a lot of hope too. And the third is that heading into 2024, we have pro-democracy officials up and down the ballot in these local positions and in statewide offices that have shown us time and time again that they're going to stand up for the will of the people, and that's really important, and I'm really happy about that.
Okay, we're gonna do something a little fun and quick as we wrap up our session here. So we're just gonna do a couple of rapid fire questions, okay? So what is one statistic or fact about election workers that everyone should know?
Okay, so I mentioned that trust is highest at the local level in our elections, and at the same time, over 70% of Americans say that they would prefer that every legal vote was counted more than having their preferred candidate win. So what that tells us is that people inherently believe in the democratic institutions that we have, and they trust their local election officials to carry forward. I'm sorry, that's this might be a theme.
Okay, so what is one book or article about democracy that everyone should read?
So I really think everyone should read or watch the news where they grew up. We live in a really decentralized media environment, and a lot of people are consuming sort of things that reinforce our perspectives. And it's really important to support local news, but it's also really important to understand what people across the country are hearing and seeing.
And last question, in 3 words, your favorite 3s, how are you feeling about the state of democracy right now?
If I were to ask my toddler, she would say tacos. But I think it's ready to work.
Well, thank you very much, Lizzie, and